Hello, hello to all who is listening and watching. Hello to dear classmates and of course dear professor. My name is Javid Farzaliev. I am from Azerbaijan, Baku, and I am full-time master's program student of European Legal Studies program. And welcome to my presentation about overview of transitional justice and project-based learning. Most of us, including me, experienced this way of learning, project-based learning, for the first time. However, since the very first moment of the process, I have realized that how innovative this can be and how effective it can be potentially. One of the very first points that need to be made is that in this approach, the emphasis switches from grades to learning, and it makes the learning process much less stressful and much more entertaining. There is a great short video among the materials called "Can you translate it for me?" YouTube video. The very first question that may come to mind is that why this video is among the list of materials. I think the answer is that this video and the experiment demonstrated in the video emphasizes on the strong impact of project-based learning. And now I am going to explain why and how I think this way. So we all regularly see and get informed about how unacceptable it is to mistreat a person based on their skin color or ethnic origin. However, most of these are usually in a written form, and we don't see how it feels to humiliate a person based on their race and see their reaction in the first place. This particular experiment, however, puts people in that situation and makes them pronounce those humiliations to the face of the other person and see their reactions. And in a very short time, they all realize how undesired and actually disgusting it is to be in that situation. They realize it through their own real-time experience, and I believe that this experience will be unforgettable for the participants of the experiment. And I think that is how the project-based learning can function, and that is how it is supposed to work. It is based on learning through experiencing, experimenting, and practicing. You learn the thing by actually doing it, and you will remember what you have learned for the rest of your life, or at least for the better part of your life. So coming to transitional justice, I will start with a relatively broad and general overview. As far as I understand, the transitional justice as a concept in its broadest form requires existence of four elements. There must be a process of political transformation or transition, and in most cases from one kind of regime to another, and the end resulting regime is form of democracy with rule of law. There must be victims of past aggression, victims who have suffered the breach of their fundamental rights, such as their right to life, freedom, and security. And aggressors who committed these atrocities or war crimes, they might be a structural force such as the government of previous regime or insurgent forces within the country. And of course, there is always a need to restore and create peace between these parties and establish the future coexistence. We can understand it better if we put these elements into a hypothetically chronological order. So first, political transformation causes violence between the regime or its supporters of the regime as armed groups in one side of the conflict, and the opponents of the regime on the other side, who is going to be probably the victims of aggression. And after the aggressor side is defeated, or abandons violence voluntarily and decides to participate in establishment of democracy, there is need to restore and consolidate peace between aggressors and victims. However, I think that a period of aggression probably does not only cover the transition period, but a long period until even the attempts to transition starts. And this period may also include mass violence of fundamental rights, which in turn triggers the transition. So by looking at the PowerPoint slides, I realized that the last stage of transition, which is the need to consolidate peace, requires all other three elements to come together. It requires the period of violence and acts of violence from transition period to be acknowledged, mainly by aggressors. And it requires both aggressors and victims to come together and agree on future and hopefully peaceful and long-lasting coexistence. Before coming more or less to details, I would like to make an emphasis on a very important question, which is asking, why should a state emerging from its ashes, a newly emerging state, should care about a successful transitional justice period? I see that not depending on the model of transitional justice being applied, not depending on the model, there are 5 elements that are common to all 4 models. I want to start with the element that I think is the most important one, and it is the agreement on future guarantees in non-repetition, ensuring that there will not be a repetition of the past aggressions. This is important because without the parties trusting in each other and trusting in non-repetition of past aggressions, the coexistence is not going to last. And establishment of coexistence is one of the 3 main objectives of successful transitional justice period. The parties must be convinced that there will not be a repetition of aggression, so they do not focus on defending themselves, but they focus on participating in the public life and each other's life, and which is hopefully going to form a strong foundation for newly emerging democratic state. So this is one of the points answering why an emerging state should care about this process, this period, because this is vital. The successful transitional justice period is vital for future existence of democracy and state itself. However, the process of ensuring future guarantees can be a long and painful process in itself, because it may require members of armed groups and other aggressive actors to be separated from public life, or even more structural reformations in armed force and police force of the state. So in order to achieve the trust in future guarantees, non-repetition, the new state needs to go through other elements such as restoring justice, which includes identification of aggressors and victims, and realization and acknowledgement of crimes. Promotion of truth, including the related history, inclusion of related history to educational materials and legislation. However, this kind of inclusion in history materials, for example, or in legislation, in education, needs to be done in such a manner that it does not trigger future hatred between parties and does not create a way to a potential revenge, where the next generation of victims pick up guns, get organized, and start acting for the sake of revenge. So this way of truth-seeking, the way of truth-seeking and establishing truth in education or in legislation should be done in such a manner that it is it contributes to the peaceful coexistence, future coexistence. And of course, the role of reparations. United Nations Secretary General guides note that for transitional justice period to be in compliance with the international legal obligations, the authorities have to ensure the right of the victims to all the objectives that I listed before, such as truth-seeking, justice, and including their right to reparations. So we know that the reparation can take a form of material or symbolic benefits, including monetary compensation, medical or psychological services, health services, return of property or compensation for the loss of property, and even official public apologies, building museums, memorials, and establishing specific days for commemoration of the victims of the aggression. From the potential content of reparations, we see that these objectives, elements that are common for every model of transitional justice, such as the reparations, truth-seeking, establishing justice, reparation, are not mutually exclusive at all. They are not mutually exclusive. In fact, truth-seeking, establishing justice, and reparations are kind of objectives that enforce each other, and applying a more holistic approach to the process can help truth commissions and authorities to achieve much more successful transitional justice process. The same guideline by United Nations tells us that based on experience, most successful reparation programs are designed in consultation with affected communities, particularly victims and women groups. For this purpose, truth commissions firstly need to identify the victims. They need to identify the victims of aggression and then consult with them on matters of reparations. As we see, there is a synthesis of combination of at least two elements, truth-seeking and reparations. So in any case, they are not mutually exclusive, and actually they complement each other during the process. However, the level of focus and commitment on each of these objectives may change depending on what model of transitional justice is going to be applied. For example, punitive and retributive model has mostly been used for identifying and punishing the aggressors, and it focuses on punitive purposes rather than creating a basis for future coexistence. In contrast, we may say that in application of the forgiveness and oblivion model, the authorities avoid large-scale punitive process and criminal trials. The authorities avoid these trials mostly because that is the same government who committed the aggression, and that is the same government who currently directs the transitional process. An important argument against the effectiveness of this model is that this model is not going to be practical in situations with clearly known and identified authors of aggressions, and in those situations the victim communities are going to think that the justice has not been fulfilled, the justice has not been served, and in that case the future coexistence or success of the future coexistence might be under a big question. I believe that's all for today and for this presentation that I can talk about. Thank you for watching and listening.